Winter Latina Show.
Hosted by IDM.
And we are live. Hello, everybody. Whoever is in the chat, say hi. Say if the sound is about all right. Hello, Nina. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I see that you're actually dressed up in a sweater, so you're not resembling Zelensky on this particular episode of the exciting Winter Latina Show. So thank you for cleaning yourself up. I
even shaved.
I know it's remarkable. I am in the frozen land full of snow and ice. You are not. So our climates are currently diverging. And of course, this is a holiday week. Well, it's not supposed to be a week, but people turn it into a week in the US. So if there are any Americans watching us right now, let us know if you have started engaging in gluttony or if you went to the gym today to burn off extra calories so that you could engage in gluttony tomorrow, because I know this is what people normally do. But anyway, we have another fun-filled episode. This one is not going to be filled with death and destruction. Might have some cheesy jokes coming from me because that's what always happens. But we want to discuss something that we have touched upon previously, which is BRICS, but we want to put this into context, kind of a broader international context with the G7. Are these two organizations in competition with each other? This is what the Western media has us believe. If we look at some of the more recent economic forecasts coming from international organizations, obviously the International Monetary Fund comes to mind first and foremost. They talk about the slowing down of the economies in the G7 countries. And then, of course, they talk about the amazing economic contributions coming from BRICS. Now, to play the devil's advocate, the G7 supporters would claim that, of course, G7 are more mature economies, so they're not supposed to be developing as fast as economies that are defined as developing by these economic bodies. So it's completely normal. Although what's been going on in Europe with the escalation with the Ukrainian situation since 2022 is nothing, cannot really be called normal. So this is why we have our guest today. I'm going to say his name in English and then he'll come on and he'll correct me in Portuguese. In English, I would pronounce his name as Raphael Machado. And he is a Brazilian political commentator, analyst, translator. His educational academic background is in law, so he's well-versed in this field. And I think it's really nice to have more of a Latin American presence on this channel. I know we've had a lot of Europeans here. I think we had a very high percentage of Serbs, and I think we'll continue to do that because they're some of my favorite guests. But it's definitely something that we want to do. We want to diversify the geographic regions in terms of contributors. We will cover some Latin American topics in the future, especially historic ones, which are interesting to me. But today we'll have our guest that Marcelo is about to bring on to talk about something more modern and present day related.
Yeah, so I just have Who Cares commenting if it's Ralph Macchio from Karate Kid. No, it's Raphael Machado.
I might as well. We might as well. Yeah, that could be your nickname.
Well remembered.
Yeah.
So yeah, without further ado, let's bring my friend and our colleague here also with the presence, eventual presence in the IDM channel, Raphael Machado. Here we go. Hello, Raphael. And yeah, no, forget everything. As usual, I forgot to put you guys on the screen. Don't worry, it's quick and it's done. Hello, Raphael. How are you doing, my friend?
Okay. Hello, Nina, because ladies first. Hello, Marcelo. Well, it's always a pleasure being here in Mass Destruction Press. And now in Winter Latina Show. I've been here before in Marcelo's channel in other occasions, but it's the first time with Nina. So it's a pleasure. And, well, I'm ready to talk
Welcome.
about.
Welcome.
Thank you very
So
much.
today you guys are gonna dominate this my little side of YouTube. Little for now. Well, we're still looking forward to the future millions. This is going to be a South American dominant podcast today, and so yeah, we want to discuss sort of the. I don't know if you want to touch upon the histories of the G7 and then BRICS or BRICS Plus. I would definitely want to talk about the way, maybe a little bit, in which Russia was kicked out in a very virtue signaled way in 2014 as a result of basically reacquiring Crimea after a popular referendum. And of course, interestingly enough, none of the G7 countries sanctioned each other or kicked each other out during any of the previous wars, actual wars, like, Iraq being the most obvious example, or any of the other ones since this organization first came to be. So if you could start maybe with a little bit of history for each of the two, you don't have to go into too much detail. And then we want to bring it to the present day and maybe talk about some of these economic forecasts and talk about the way that these two organizations are usually pitted against each other, and perhaps for good reason, or maybe not.
Well, thank you very much. Beginning with G7, because it's older than BRICS, very shortly, it's one of those international structures that belongs to, in my opinion, a kind of dead world, in the sense that it was born in the context of the Cold War, also in the context of the development of neoliberalism. The 70s was the time when neoliberalism was beginning to implant itself in the economies of a lot of countries. It became basically the the economic rule during the 90s, but during the 70s and the 80s, it was already being discussed at first Anglo-Saxon countries and even Latin American countries, with Chile, for example. But little by little, from the G7, from the 70s onwards, it began to seep into the social fabric, political fabric of the other countries, like Germany and France and Japan and the other countries, of course, not only of G7. The major principle or the axis around G7 works. It's basically the building of a world market economy with as little as barriers and protection as possible. And in this sense, G7 is part of a constellation of other international institutions that work basically towards building what we understand as a kind of a global structure that, well, conspiracy theorists would call New World Order, or we could refer to it as globalism, but we don't need to make use of conspiracy theories to understand all this process, because it's basically an attempt at managing the expansion of globalization and the destruction of all kinds of frontiers, barriers to the flow of persons, to the flow of capital, to the flow of goods. It coincides, for example, it isn't a coincidence that we see the growth of migration towards Europe, for example, from the 70s onwards, and also the invasion of Europe by US products, by Coca-Cola, McDonald's, etc., because it's basically an attempt at integrating these countries first in this global society, global market, and then irradiating from the G7 to other less developed countries these same principles, market principles, liberal principles. Eventually, Russia was accepted at the club. And why was Russia accepted at the club? Because in the West, there have been basically two views of Russia. We could call it a distinction between Kissinger and Brzezinski. Uh, those who follow Brzezinski ideas, as a matter of fact, want to impose an eternal siege, an eternal military and political diplomatic siege against Russia until it breaks up. And those who follow the principles of Henry Kissinger, recently deceased, they have another kind of approach, a softer approach that would see Russia being slowly integrated into the West, but we could sum it up as an exchange of its soul, because all these attempts at integrating Russia into the West, with the collaboration of those who we could call the sixth column or the fifth column of the Russian oligarchs and liberals. It's basically an attempt at westernizing Russia, turn Russia as close to as a Western market economy as possible. And that's why Russia was accepted into G7 and it became G8 until, as Nina, as a matter of fact, already said, Russia was suspended and never came back. As a matter of fact, it was expelled because it's an eternal suspension is an expulsion because of the situation in Crimea, of the reintegration of Crimea in 2014. And but well, jumping already to modern times, to current times, of course, we can't discount the importance of G7. It's very obvious because it is still a group of countries that is responsible for more or less a third of the world GDP, a big part of the world's wealth generation. But as a matter of fact, if we take a look at what's been happening with the G7 countries, especially in the last 2 years, well, we just need to take a look at Germany, for example. I'd say that Germany is the clearest example of the at least stagnation or, as a matter of fact, decadence of this model of development, because we've had already for car plants from Volkswagen and Audi closing. We've had yesterday, if I'm correct, ThyssenKrupp's plants closing also, with all of that together, 100 or 200 people jobless in Germany, and that's rare for German economy since the end of the Second World War. If we are talking about West Germany, and in general, if we are talking about Germany, we haven't seen anything like that before since the end of the Cold War, since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And Germany isn't creating new jobs. It isn't a situation where Germany is closing a sector to open another sector, because we have this process where old school Fordist capitalism is being overcome by a fourth industrial capitalism, or whatever we can call it, where it's more focused on high technology, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, etc. But nothing of that is happening in Germany, as a matter of fact. Countries where these new developments in capitalism is happening are the Asian countries, mostly China, South Korea still, Taiwan, though it's part of China, a bit Japan, and other southeastern Asian countries, and still the United States, because of course they have enough capital to invest in these new developments. But the problem is not only in Germany, though the German case, of course, is the most blatant because it's the most unusual. In France, we have public debt, a huge public debt. Even some bureaucrats in the European Union are talking about imposing some small sanctions against France because of Macron's inability to control this debt. And then they are talking again in France about a new pension reform, though they've had a pension reform 2 years ago. I don't know. France seems to be doing pension reforms and labor reforms every 2 years because they have been unable to control their own budget. And why? Because the economic model of the G7 countries, which is neoliberalism, has been unable to guarantee growth. And if they don't guarantee growth, they need to begin making budget cuts that always are in health services, education services, and other public services or public or common good services. And this is basically the tendency. In Japan, for example, we have the problem of the demographic problem, which is also, of course, it's more radical in Japan, but it's the same problem that European countries also have. And well, Canada and the US can only avert it basically through mass migration, which represents another kind of problem. And because all of that is ideologically integrated, also in Japan, they are talking about opening Japan to mass migration, which will basically bring the same problems that Europeans and North Americans are having to Japan. And I actually think the Japanese aren't the least prepared to the problems of mass migration. We already see many videos on the internet about some strange stuff that happened in public spaces in Japan because of excessive tourism, for example, and also because of the small amounts of migration that they are already receiving. And basically, that's the scenario we see in the G7 countries nowadays. Basically, economic stagnation in most countries, mass migration, the inability to guarantee economic growth. When these countries grow, it's 1 or 2% a year, usually not enough to accommodate for the needs of the people. The high cost of living because of the sanctions against Russia and because of energetic problems, and these attempts at energy transition to impose a green agenda which affects farmers in the G7 countries, farmers in France especially, but also in the United Kingdom, in Germany more during the beginning of the year, and other G7 countries have been protesting. We saw the situation with the truck drivers in Canada some time ago. These sectors of the economy, which are connected to farming and logistics, because logistics is connected to farming as the way that goods are transported from inner towns and the rural sector to the cities and also to the ports for exports. That's the scenario with the G7, as a matter of fact. And
so let me ask you a couple of questions. I think this was a great summary of history going into the present day. To what extent would Germany still be experiencing such significant problems if it were not for deliberately cutting off Germans' access to cheap Russian energy? Because it seems like that was a huge part of the so-called German economic miracle. And yes, of course, there are other things that are happening that are part of the sort of broader system that I think you described very well. But it seems that because of that particular issue, Germany is such an outlier, where all of these kind of more traditional industrial sectors, like the car sector that you mentioned, are impacted the most. So do you think Germany would have stagnated quite as much if it weren't for deliberately cutting cheap Russian energy?
Not quite as much. We see, for example, that France, we can say that it's faring good currently, but it isn't in the same situation, the same decadent economic situation as Germany, because they have invested on nuclear power. And Germans, with though it's usually a very smart people, they have basically decided to close all their nuclear power plants to go for this utopian idea of energy transition, green energy, etc. And well,
Green
they could
coal.
manage,
And
yes,
coal. Coal.
and alcohol, as a matter of fact. Well, they could maybe do this energy transition little by little if they had access to cheap Russian gas, which they used to have. And the fact that the German government, didn't do anything, even after what happened, it was the most cooked thing I have ever seen in politics. It was so sad, it was
Pathetic.
simply pathetic. Yes, it was sad to see a chancellor of Germany just accepting what happened and keeping this company, keeping basically towing the line of the West. But no, it would still be somewhat stagnant because it's the situation, it's the context of neoliberal Western economy nowadays. Though usually Germany compensates through sub-imperialism in European countries, where they guarantee very beneficial agreements with the poorer countries of the European Union, like Portugal, and Greece and Romania, Bulgaria, etc., so that German businesses can enter these countries to extract capital and basically take down competition in these countries. But now it's unable to do that because of the lack of access to cheap energy, and of course solar power and wind power, and even the coal power plants can't compensate for the lack of cheap Russian gas. And that's also why some of these businesses are going to the United States. So it's ridiculous because
Or China.
or China, yes. But the idea in the United States is to attract these German companies, and I think under Trump, it's going to be even more clear how the situation with Germany is bad, because I don't think Trump will have any kind of sympathy for the German plight, and he will keep trying to attract these German companies to the United States.
It's as if the whole situation with Nord Stream was deliberate to exert greater control over what's left of Europe, and of course to separate Russia from this market. What I'd like you to talk about is
that.
I know.
Just to jump in just a second, it's I had this kind of insight the other day. You were mentioning the fourth industrial revolution with AI and all that. And I, some time ago in a live stream, I was talking, I don't remember with whom, I think Hugo Dionisio, and we were talking about the Industrial Revolution in the United States, where the United States held basically 60% of all the productions in the 50s and 60s, more or less, 60% of all industrial production of the planet. And we were talking about China, and we were saying, yeah, we probably won't see that again in the world, because, the countries are now rising, rapidly, more rapidly. And then I saw some interesting graph or plots from artificial intelligence being used and produced in China, and it was astonishing the amount the Chinese artificial intelligence products and subproducts and use was so ahead of the rest of the planet that I was like, well, perhaps we are going to see something even in a bigger scale than we saw in the middle 20th century in the United States. But it's, and in the other hand, yeah, it looks like the West are still believes that they hold the they are the only one that holds the technology for chips and electronics, basically. And well, they are still the most advanced at the moment, but China is growing also very fast, and also Russia now is producing. They are very behind on that, but they are getting there. And I think that once they understood that they have to have their own production, they're going to go ahead quicker and faster than, well, it took the West to arrive in this position because the technology is now known. It's just,
There was a big brain drain from Russia. I mean, starting from the 90s, but even
yeah,
more recently. So a lot of these computer scientists and related professions did immigrate to the West. Of course, many of them went to the US and Canada. So it's not really surprising that there is that gap, right, between Russian development. But I think academically, Russia is probably one of the top countries to produce specialists in this field, as well as engineering and various applied type scientists. Well, of course, not just applied, theoretical as well, theoretical physics. So I think Russia has the potential to catch up. I mean, I'm not sure when and how this will happen, but the potential is definitely there. So what I'd like you to talk about is I guess we can describe it as the hierarchy within the G7, because there are two ways of looking at it. One way is to say that there are these, again, if we put on our tinfoil hats, that these are these international elites. They surpass the interest of any particular country, even in the G7. They have their own interests and they're not particularly attached to any of these countries. But a more traditional way of looking at it would be to say that the G7 essentially does the bidding of the United States, the most prominent member. I mean, initially it used to be the most important economy, especially when this organization was first established in the middle of the 1970s. So do you think that, well, first of all, how would you look at this hierarchy? It doesn't seem to be an equal partnership. It seems to be America first in terms of well, maybe not the interests of average Americans, but the interest of the American elites. And then if there is some kind of a trickle-down effect going to other countries that would benefit from that sort of neoliberal integration that you described, yes, then they would benefit. But these days, it seems that it's almost like, in some ways, there's a lot of damage coming from this organization, especially since the escalation in 2022. How do you look at it?
Yes, I think that the United States simply doesn't know any kind of equal partnership. I don't think it has ever established an equal partnership, even since the 19th century, as a matter of fact. We all remember, for example, the Monroe Doctrine, which was the idea of American to the Americans. But, well, I'm also American. We from South America are also American. At the beginning, Simon Bolivar, for example, used to think that when the President Monroe was talking about American for the Americans, it was meant as for everyone. But then eventually they understood that they consider themselves the Americans. So the United States simply doesn't know equal partnership. Of course, if it's convenient, and it was convenient, for example, during the Cold War, to avoid the spreading of communism and also avoid the spreading of patriotic or nationalistic movements or parties especially in Latin America or Africa, Middle East, and also in Europe, of course. And even in the 90s, when they thought that the world history had already ended and they imposed the Washington Consensus, for example, there was the perspective of everyone more or less benefiting from these arrangements, though, of course, the Americans, the United States, always profiting more than the others. But when we see a world crisis is when we see that, yes, there's a hierarchy where the United States is, of course, first, and the other nations are in second place or third place or fourth place, depending on the country, as a matter of fact. Because, of course, if we are taking a look at Germany, they are clearly treated worse than even France or the United Kingdom. Both Germany and Italy are countries where they still keep a lot of bases and where they keep most of their soldiers in Europe. So it's basically occupied countries, just like Japan. If we read G7 from the standpoint of history, we see that it's basically a coalition of the United States and, of course, other countries, where three of these countries are occupied countries, are basically colonies of the United States, then that have very little of independence in foreign affairs. I remember that President Putin, in one of maybe in one of the Valdai speeches, talked about how he was told by some European leaders that they are all being spied upon and blackmailed, and that they actually can do almost nothing against the United States because they have no actual freedom. And of course, there's this perspective that see from the standpoint of global elite, and it's in some sense it's true, because there is it's part of the development of capitalism, and I associate what we call globalism as in more or less Leninist terms as something, as another kind of stage of development of capitalism. We had imperialism, where we have these national bourgeois elites, because these elites achieved the status of national monopolies in their sectors. But when these monopolies overcome the borders of their own countries, that's when we begin to see the development of what we call globalism. And of course, some of these guys, they you can have a billionaire in the United States who marries I don't know, a Japanese heiress, and a guy in France who marries a Brazilian member of an oligarchic family, etc. And everything begins to be more or less mixed among these elites. But there are differences among them, because these elites, they still have their own intentions, or at least the pretension to become the focus point of these global building of a global world government or whatever. We see clearly in France, for example, where Macron obviously has his own model of globalism, where it isn't the United States and McDonald's and Coca-Cola the pattern of world culture and the world values, but the values of the French Revolution, of Illuminism, of this Republican idea that the French defend. So that there exists a global elite, and at the same time differences among these elites, which become clearer whenever there's a crisis. That's what we have been seeing now. We also see that with the German elites. We simply don't seem to care really about their own country, and who insists on trying to pressure their own government into a conflict with Russia. It's even clearer with the United Kingdom, which is much more radical in their belligerence than even the United States. Most of what we have seen from provocations against Russia have actually mostly begun in London than in Washington. Of course, maybe London is acting as an outsourced agent of the United States. A chihuahua, yes. But yes, maybe they had, it's an attempt at recovering world protagonism, because as we have seen, the United Kingdom, which was attempting at achieving global hegemony in the 19th century, lost everything after the Second World War, and they resent it deeply. They feel a very big resentment against the United States because of that, and that's why they are the biggest provokers against Russia. But yes, I see the hierarchy. I also see that there is a high degree of integration, but that these elites, though they are much more integrated than the peoples of their countries, they also have their differences among them, which is always becoming much clearer whenever there is a crisis.
All roads take to London, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say we've had some cogent arguments on this channel to show that perhaps London is sort of the center as opposed to just a chihuahua, like you've termed it, who is acting upon someone else's orders. And of course, the, let's call them complicated British-Russian relations go back centuries, where there is that antagonism. I mean, we can't forget the fact that the British foreign policy is primarily based on making sure that no serious power arises in the continental part of Europe, whether that would be Germany or Russia, because their entire foreign policy was to sort of instigate conflicts between the powers that were on the rise to make sure that they stay at the top. And of course, these days, as you pointed out, the British Empire no longer exists. Yes, there's sort of the Commonwealth, and Canada, speaking of chihuahuas, likes to officially consider the Queen or now the King as the head of its state, at least symbolically. But yes, I think there is some resentment there. We might not be seeing it in public. Behind the scenes, though, I suspect it's much, much more serious. So definitely, I agree. I think the UK has been more belligerent towards Russia in the last few years. If you think about, the Kerch Bridge terrorist attack, that would be sort of the most obvious example, but there are others as well. Go ahead.
Just a very interesting fact that I didn't know, of course, because I'm not a historian, someone that studies too much history, but perhaps you can confirm that to me or deny it. Yesterday, I was watching a live stream with Larry Johnson and George Galloway, and at some point George just mentioned it's not by chance that the First World War, 3 of the involved countries were ruled by grandsons of Queen Victoria.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at photographs of, the family of Nicholas II, and their sort of side-by-side images with the British royalty, I mean, they look very, very closely related. I mean, they were also related to the German ruler. So, just a couple weeks prior to the official start of World War I, they're writing letters to each other saying, "Dear Nicky" and "Dear Willie." The German and the Russian resembled each other less than the English and the Russian sort of, ruling families. But the resemblance is definitely there. It's actually pretty uncanny. Yeah, it's definitely not a surprise, but there are other sort of quasi-conspiracy theories. For instance, there's the assassination of Paul, who was, a Tsar, or supposed to be a Tsar, that many people believe had links to Britain, although it is considered a conspiracy theory. Some people would say that it's been proven beyond the reasonable doubt, as people in the court of law would say in the US, that perhaps that did happen. I'm going to refrain from sharing an opinion. I would have to look into that question further. But it's definitely something that goes back centuries, as opposed to the the relationship between the U.S. and Russia was pretty good in the 19th century. I mean, we talked about this a little bit on this channel. Of course, at that stage, the United States was not a superpower, and I would sort of make the comment about the Monroe Doctrine a little bit more nuanced, because the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which was in 1904, was definitely very, very brazen in terms of saying that the United States not only should intervene, let's say economically, but militarily in the affairs of the, its backyard. This was with Teddy Roosevelt. But the initial Monroe Doctrine, which was, the early 1800s, it was actually the trigger for it was Russian expansion in North America. So Russia was not just expanding into Alaska. It had, something like Fort Ross in California. So the Americans were actually almost like more threatened by Russia on the west coast of North America than they were threatened by other sort of powers that have been here previously, like Spain and France. So that was so in their opinion, it was defensive. I think these days we can look at it and say, yes, it was defensive because the country was new and still fairly weak, but the roots of this as our continent, and we consider ourselves Americans, and we're going to ignore all those other Americans that live south of us. I think the roots were definitely there, but I would say it was still much more defensive than the thing that came in 1904, which is the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And that's, that particular document instigated, or I would say justified, a lot of the so-called interventionism in, Cuba and Nicaragua, et cetera, and, many other countries. I think we'll do a separate episode on that. But my question is, if we look at the period of the G7 when it was the G8, and it included Russia, which I think was like late 90s, 1997, until the acquisition of Crimea in 2014. So it was a pretty long-ish period. You said that the idea behind that was to incorporate Russia into sort of the Western order. Well, I guess these days it's called the rules-based order. We don't really know what it means, but that's the term that that gets thrown around. But you kind of said that they were trying to model Russia and have it become this sort of a Western-style economy. In my opinion, it was more about purely having access to Russian resources without really caring about the internal dynamics. I mean, as long as the political system in Russia was not intervening and interfering with having as much access as possible and having beneficial, essentially, circumstances for these Western companies coming in. I don't think they ever had any interest in transforming Russia into anything close and bringing it up, let's say economically, to the Western European powers. But that's my opinion. What do you think?
Well, it's pretty much possible because, as we all know, Russia has huge resources, especially they're especially useful for energy sector. As a matter of fact, we are talking about oil and mostly, of course, gas, land as much as you'd like, and other resources. Of course, it's basically one of the major world sources of fertilizers. And there's a lot of other aspects that Russia could contribute to the economies of the G7. Though, of course, I don't think that they were interested in the good of the Russians, but they seem to be interested in at least keeping things in Russia as they were in the 90s, in a kind of chaotic liberal democracy. That's why, for example, since then, and since a bit before, as a matter of fact, George Soros began working in Russia even, and tried to open there a division of the open society. So in the sense that they were trying to keep things as it were in the 90s, I think they were. But in the sense that, for example, they would wish to turn Russia into a normal, stable republic or something like that. I agree with you. They were much more interested in Russian resources than anything else. So it's both at the same time. When I said that they wanted to integrate Russia into the Western world, It's a kind of integration where, of course, Russia would be a second-class country, not as the Russian elites thought Russia would be treated, and but at the same time where the hegemonic values would be the values of neoliberalism, of consumerism, Western style aesthetics, culture, pop culture, and that kind of things, that especially because these kinds of things, I think, make any people more open to be manipulated by the West. For example, in Brazil, whenever there's talk about China, what people, mostly right-wing people, debate is that, and I'm going to say it literally, no, it's much better to be dominated by the United States than by China. Bro, why do you want to be dominated by whoever, but they are so so dominated by brainwashed by Western values, consumering patterns and aesthetics, etc., that that's instrumental for them to be more easily exploited by the West. Of course, there's the trickle-down effect where there's a little benefit, but Western values are used in this way in countries like Brazil or other Latin American countries, and I think that that's the way Western values were used in Russia also in the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, you can't separate the liberal ideology from the economic system of capitalism. I mean, you know full well that in liberalism, the historical subject is the individual, but it's not just, individuals like you and I and Marcelo. It's an individual that completely has been stripped of any kind of traditional attachment to their communities that they used to have, whether it be religion or some other kind of cultural traditional forms and customs. And of course, that individual is not just much easier to manipulate, it's also the kind of individual that, I refer to this individual as an autonomous human unit, because those are the autonomous human units that are much easier to combine into random target markets and say, this is your new community, and now you're going to be advertised to and basically create this fake community on top of something that used to be authentic and not artificial. And on top of that, I think the idea of G7 that you mentioned, that is sort of linked more to the old world, would you say that it's about the fact that it's in the very nature of capitalism. Capitalism obviously functions based on capital accumulation, if we take maybe Marxist thought here to define it, and on expansion. So at some point, there's nowhere to expand. And I think this is the point that we've reached, not even now, but a few years ago. And so because there's nowhere to expand, there is this absolute crisis that we're seeing. And that's one of the sort of deeper roots behind the stagnation that we're seeing in the G7. How would you qualify it?
Yes, well, some decades ago, we could say that the expansion of capital was still possible because the frontier was still there in Africa and the Middle East and certain parts of Asia. Though what happens is that, well, first, of course, we are talking about the Middle East. There's the Israel factor, which, as a matter of fact, represented a barrier to the expansion of traditional capital. Most people don't know, but the oil industry was no way interested in the Iraqi war, because, as a matter of fact, the oil industry wanted the opening of relationships with Saddam Hussein and also with the Iranians and other, and we even with Gaddafi, as a matter of fact. I think that's mentioned, for example, by John Mearsheimer in his book about the Israeli lobby, that the oil industry, in other words, this very important and big capitalistic sector of the United States, was interested in decent, stable relations with the countries of the Middle East, but then we have the Israeli factor, the Zionist factor that wanted war for security reasons and for expansionistic pretensions. So the frontier was there, but there were other geopolitical situations that made it impossible for the expansion of capital in these last frontiers. Not many of these factors weren't the kind of external factors where, for example, chaos or war is imposed on these territories, but maybe simply the fact that in the development of these countries, their own elites decided that they wanted a divorce from the West, like what happened in China, for example, little by little, very little by little, but also what we have seen in Iran, and that the fact that nowadays, when we could say that in Africa, there's already a kind of established ground for the development of capitalistic relations, the African countries, as a matter of fact, decided that they prefer to establish their economic relations with mostly China and also, of course, Russia, and even in some specific countries with Iran or other countries. In some cases with Brazil, with Venezuela, etc. So yes, they wanted to expand the frontiers of capital to devour the whole world, because that's implicit in the idea itself of globalism, and it's part of this project in the postmodern era of capitalism. But they found many of these kinds of barriers, some of them in the national elites of these countries, some because part of the Western elites are unpredictable from an economic rationalistic standpoint, like the Zionist elites, which doesn't actually prioritize economics above other kinds of considerations, like they have even shown recently very clearly. So yes, that's one of the major reasons of the crisis, and that's why the crisis was unpredictable. We have grown accustomed, for example, with a kind of position from these countries where they always try to accommodate the growing Western demands. I think that, for example, most people didn't predict that the special military operation would begin. Most people said, "Oh, Putin's gonna try to accommodate with this situation, etc." Because we have grown accustomed to these kinds of situations where the West pressures, and the other countries try to adapt from a rationalistic, pragmatic standpoint. And they also didn't predict, for example, no one predicted that China would want to decouple somewhat from Western interests and from the United States. Everyone thought that China was one, that they would be forever the sweatshop of the world and absolutely nothing else. So there were a lot of situations that could not be predicted, as a matter of fact, and at least they could not be predicted from the framework that the Western elites were working with. That made it basically very hard for the expansion of capital to the limits of the known world.
Thank you for that.
There's
Go ahead.
just a second. There's one thing that you mentioned that I think is a key point for that, is that the fact that the industrial elites wanted stable relations around the globe, and that's good for industry, but for financial countries, financialized countries, you need floating markets, you need instabilities. So I think that's also a symptom of also the United States industrial decadence and finance rising. Am I saying that right?
I think
guess something
I
like
understand what you're saying, and also it's almost like if you can't rise up, you have to bring others down, which is what we're seeing in Europe. Some countries in Europe are being brought down deliberately, right? Like Germany, as opposed to everyone going up.
What I mean basically is that Wall Street hawks gain a lot of money if markets are floating.
Yeah, no, I
stable
understand that too. It's
commercial
in
relations.
some ways it's much easier to deal with a chaotic, weak country or a region than it is with a.
Especially when you control the chaos.
Exactly. I think that's a good point. And I think we should shift gears to BRICS since China has entered the conversation here. Of course, we keep mentioning Russia and Brazil as well. But my first question is, and of course, I'm going to be interrupted by one of our two pets here. There we go. I don't know how much of him you can see. I think you can see his nose. Usually they come at the end, but I guess this is an early warning with the Basset here.
I just have to confirm with Raphael, how long do you still have available? Because you have the radio show in...
More 15 minutes, I think.
Sure. So we definitely want to shift gears to BRICS. And so my question is, to what extent is the concept of Chimerica, which was the economic entity and the integration of China and America, is still relevant? Because some analysts say what you've been saying is that, yes, it's been slow, but there is a decoupling happening and China is looking for other markets. But other people say that, no, the two are so integrated that it's just not even possible for China to decouple from the US to any significant extent.
Well, that's even one of the reasons why there are many skeptics about de-dollarization, for example. But from what I have seen in news, especially from the last two years, and especially after Nancy Pelosi decided to pay unwanted visit to Taiwan, basically. And there were many interesting memes during what happened at the time. But I've noticed a kind of change in how the Chinese elites saw the West since that flight from Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan. And since then, we have seen many news, especially in the high-tech industry, where the Chinese seem to be attempting to make their production lines a bit shorter, transferring some of their economic relations from the United States to South Korea, for example, or to other regional countries. I seem to remember that China and South Korea signed some semiconductor agreement some months ago, or in the beginning of the year, or something like that, where before that it was the kind of the specific kind of product that they were receiving from the United States. We have seen recently, for example, that China has begun selling in Saudi Arabia public debt titles, papers in dollar, basically creating a parallel dollar market in Saudi Arabia, which of course uses dollar, but it's basically giving control to China to a part of international dollar trade, weakening the dollar. So I'd say that, and even these meetings between United States authorities, both Biden and Blinken, and Chinese authorities, of course, there are always the official speeches and announcements. But of course, there's of course always the things that they don't say. But even if we take only the things that they say, there was one of these meetings, I think, between Blinken and Xi, where they talked about the economic relations between China and the United States, in the sense that they didn't want it to be to change it too quickly. So they made it more or less clear that yes, things are happening, but we don't want it to happen too quickly. And I think it's better for both parts of this equation that any kind of decoupling that, in my opinion, seems to be happening very, very slowly, but that any kind of decoupling will be extremely slow, where little by little we have seen, for example, I think this month or last month, more sanctions against some Chinese companies, especially in the high-tech sector, as always, and the Chinese by themselves also trying to find new sources of raw materials or of technological parts for their industry. So I think the idea of Chimerica is basically nowadays it can be considered outdated. It was something, of course, that seemed very plausible, and it's interesting that in the 90s that created even some degree of apprehension from Russian specialists, from Russian geopoliticians, because in the 90s, yes, it seemed that things were extremely good between China and the United States, and that, of course, worried Russian patriots. But already at the time, it seems that the Chinese elites were, I don't know if I can say that they changed their minds, because, well, the Maoists would say that Deng Xiaoping always wanted things to become like they are now with Xi Jinping. I don't know if that's how he was already thinking about at the time. But in the 90s, there were already some very important changes in the sense that China was already beginning to build more complex stuff. It was growing out of the status of a sweatshop nation to becoming a basic industry nation, where they were already, for example, doing reverse engineering and beginning to build copies of Western products, but copies that were day by day better and more complex, unto the point where we are right now.
So, would you say the relationship within BRICS is dominated by China the way the G7 is dominated by the US, or is it a more equitable relationship? Because yes, China is a huge economic power, but it seems to not be interested in exporting its cultural values the way the United States would, in addition to having that kind of economic control. How do you view the situation within BRICS?
Yes, I absolutely agree with you, because I think there's most people don't actually understand, because most people are very accustomed to dealing with the United States. I have almost daily debates on X trying to prove to people that unipolarity is abnormal, that we won't have a Chinese unipolarity or a Russian unipolarity or anything like that, because we are living in a very specific moment. And these universalistic pretensions are pretty much connected to some specific messianic elements in the culture and identity of the United States mostly, but also of France and of the Western world in general. And these elements, though there are other kinds of messianic thought and especially in religion, in other civilizations, it isn't actually the same thing, because if we pay attention, for example, to the idea, to both the Russian and Chinese idea of empire, for example, it's something closer to, for example, Neoplatonism, in the sense that, of course, you have the one, but the one develops itself into multiplicity. So it's the kind of course, for example, there are some interesting differences between the multipolarity idea or multipolarity theory between For example, Alexander Dugin as representative of a kind of Russian thought, and Jiang Qigong as a representative of a Chinese thought, where, for example, in Jiang Qigong's thought, multipolarity is connected to an idea where, for him, China, of course, is more or less the center of the world because it is, in fact, it's the biggest economy, it's a powerhouse by itself, but where the other countries are and the other civilizations are autonomous and relate themselves to China in a mutually beneficial way. So it's very different from what we see, both in, for example, in French philosophical thought or American philosophical thought, political philosophical thought, or British political philosophical thought, where there's a kind of a more forceful universalism that we can perceive it very clearly, and that's mostly absent from Russian thought or a Chinese thought. So no, I don't think that the Chinese would want to. I don't think they control the BRICS the same way that the United States controls the G7. The Chinese word has weight, of course, but I have never seen the Chinese trying to interfere, for example, into cultural or internal laws. When you do a deal with the IMF, you always sometimes they ask for things that aren't even connected to economics, like to get these lending, you need to approve LGBTQ etc. laws in your country. What does have to do with economy? There's nothing to do with economy, and the Chinese don't actually do that. I have many interesting talks with African patriots, and they always say this absolutely the same thing. They can't take it anymore from the West because what we see in the European countries themselves or Latin American countries also happens in Africa with promotion of abortion, mass abortion, all these gender laws and gender identity, etc. And to the Africans, which have a much more traditional country because of historical factors than other civilizations, it is even more aberrant than even to us. And dealing with the Chinese or the Russian, there's never anything even close to what the US asks of them. The US, for example, is imposing or has imposed sanctions on Uganda, for example, because they outlawed gay marriage. And so in other words, it's a country that sometimes needs help for economic reasons because they still can't produce enough food to feed their country with their current technological level in agriculture. But well, then because they banned gay marriage, then you're going to starve them to death. So that's how Washington works, and it's something that, in my opinion, is alien to the Chinese and Russian thought.
I think that's really interesting because you mentioned Kissinger in the beginning, and I'm thinking of his book World Order from, I think it's around 2014, so he's well advanced in his age. And the way he describes Chinese mentality is very much in the way that you just described it, coming from a Chinese philosopher whom I haven't read. But basically, yes, he talked about China being the middle kingdom, right? The two characters for China sort of being the primary country around which everyone else sort of aligns, right, in a circle, but everyone has their own equal power according to their, their status. They're not going to be subject to some of these cultural issues that you just mentioned. And at the same time, Kissinger was obviously very much involved in Nixon's splitting China away from the Soviet Union and the China policy, which was very interesting in the 1970s. But Kissinger was also involved in talks, for instance, like the nuclear talks in the early 1970s. But he seems to really misunderstand Russia and the way Russia operates. So it was very interesting for me to see that book where he seems to understand China, at least the way that I would understand it, and really miss Russia and call it an enigma and just not even try to, to understand Russian philosophy and Russian foreign policy. So since we're running out of time with you, could you maybe talk about BRICS in more general terms, in terms of does this organization have a future? Should BRICS keep admitting members, or is there a case when too many members are too much, basically, because that would cause disagreements within the organization? And any other maybe summarizing thoughts that you can give us about BRICS?
Okay, I think that the major problem in BRICS right now, it's not enough formal. It doesn't have a secretariat. It doesn't have clear rules about how to deal with stuff. It's mostly improvising. And I think it's very interesting because I think improvisation is basically, and from what I've heard and what I've seen, a Brazilian thing and also a Russian thing. That these are countries that improvise very well and mostly deal improvising in weird or hard situations. But I think that's for an organism like BRICS, it's necessary to have more order and formality and do stuff more like the Germans or the Swiss than the Brazilians, the Latin Americans in general, or other of our brotherly civilizations do. Because, for example, we had the situation with Venezuela where it became very weird because I think not even then knew how to do it. It's necessary a consensus, or should we basically vote and who wins decides it? Yes, because it's not written. It's basically an agreement of gentlemen, in the sense that, okay, we are going to do by consensus, but nobody expected that Brazil would block Venezuela. I expected, but I've heard from very good sources that people were extremely angry with that in Moscow, as a matter of fact, and in Beijing also. So I think it needs more formality, more order. It needs to have a statute. It needs to have bureaucrats. Everybody hates bureaucrats, but bureaucrats sometimes are good. They help move things forward if there's someone behind them guaranteeing that they're doing their job. And BRICS needs bureaucrats so that everything that they decide, like they decided in Kazan, becomes fact. We have seen from multilateral organizations and meetings like the G20 itself, where everything ends with grandiloquent speeches and promises and etc. And they will have another meeting in a year and nothing has been solved and nothing has been done. And BRICS can't be like that, because we are already tired of this kind of stuff coming from the Western dominated organizations. So I'd say that yes, BRICS needs to become more bureaucratic. And everything else depends on how BRICS is seen. And that's the major problem, because I'd say that currently countries which are more counter-hegemonic, like Russia, Iran, and China, see BRICS in a certain way, and other countries like Brazil, especially Saudi Arabia, probably, and Saudi Arabia is basically a Schrödinger member of BRICS, because it isn't, even now, it isn't actually clear if they are officially a member or not, because it's a gray status. So it's a situation that's very weird. But for countries like Brazil, for example, maybe India, though, with the situation where the Canadians have been piecing the Indians off, I don't know how things are going to go. But for countries like Brazil and possibly some of the Arabian countries which are part of BRICS, BRICS isn't a platform to build an alternative world order. For countries like Brazil, BRICS is basically another multilateral organization that opens up possibilities and opportunities for investment, for partnerships, for logistical planning, for new trade routes, etc. It's a kind of um, it's a kind of multilateralist thought. We need to understand that there's not only unipolarity and multipolarity, but because unipolarity is US centered, there are those kinds of geopolitical thinkers who say that we need to strengthen the United Nations and these multilateral organizations to overcome national sovereignties, etc. And currently, Brazil is adopting this kind of international thought. So they see BRICS as something like that, another forum for them to create new partnerships. But and I think that the Saudis see it the same way. The guys from Emirates see it the same way, and maybe other members of BRICS. But to the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians, they seem to want to turn BRICS into a place where they can plant the seeds to overcome or to even substitute many of the Western dominated forums, institutions, etc. We have seen, for example,
like a trade-free zone.
Yes, we have seen, for example, some tendencies that, if we take, for example, Dilma Rousseff, which is now the president of the BRICS Bank, the BRICS Bank, she thinks more or less this way, more than with the Brazilian government, in the sense that they seem to want to turn the BRICS Bank into an alternative to the IMF. So BRICS seems to be trying to do this stuff whenever the Russian and the Chinese get their way. Whenever they manage to put things forward, they seem to want to basically plant the seeds for a multipolar world order. But to get to that, it's necessary, well, basically to structure it better. You need to have. I think that it will sound weird, but BRICS needs someone to defect from Europe, so that BRICS has a European representative, maybe Hungary, maybe another European country. We don't know, for example, what's going to happen with the German national elections next year, though I don't think the AfD is going to win it this time. But there are other options, as a matter of fact, in Europe. So I see it. I prefer to see it the Russian and the Chinese way, because not that the BRICS is going to be put into the place of the United Nations, but it is now the major tool to put pressure on these Western institutions, or maybe basically push them to the abyss, in the sense that if everyone begins preferring the BRICS Bank and not the IMF, well, eventually the IMF is going to go to the dustbin of history. And maybe that should happen with other global Western-dominated institutions. I think everyone, or most everyone who are from BRICS countries, have very, very bad opinions about the World Health Organization, because things years ago happened in a very weird way, and countries like, not to put it into conspiracy terms, but of course the countries that were affected and are not part of the Western consensus, they all dealt with the situation their own way, and many of them had very good results. If we take, for example, Belarus, who is now a partner of BRICS, though not a full member, well, basically President Lukashenko recommended drinking vodka, exercising, and stuff like that, and Belarus almost had no problems with the situation.
Don't do that at home.
And Venezuela, it was basically the same thing, where Maduro recommended taking care of yourself and not taking risks, etc. And I think the countries that are now part of BRICS are very careful about avoiding losing their sovereignty. And that's why, for example, when we saw these last attempted expansion of the 2030 agenda to 2045, Russia put there a revision of the terms to include a kind of declaration where the sovereignty of the countries involved in this project, to this agenda 2045, goes first, then the agenda itself, and they didn't accept it, and Russia lost this vote in the United Nations. So that's what the I think that's what the focus of the BRICS is going to be. Besides de-dollarization, M-Bridge, an alternative to SWIFT, the BRICS Bank as an alternative to the IMF, etc. It's going to be a platform for at least a revision, a reform of all Western institutions, so that they are more aligned with the idea of multipolarity.
Yeah, I mean, if the BRICS Bank isn't going to have them sign all kinds of cultural clauses that might go against their dominant, traditional way of life, it might be preferable even in this regard. Marcelo, do you have any questions before we wrap this up? Or any comments?
I think we're good. Raphael, do you have time for two quick questions? One is very quick, and another one is from the people on the chat. It's very quick.
If it is very quick, I can. Yes.
Okay, so one is very good. I'll start with a very quick one. What is the principal reason, from Robert? What is the principal reason for Europe, America falling behind? Are we too dumb, lazy, or expensive? Yes. No, I guess. Well, one of the things that I can mention on that is the quality and quantity of STEM universities and graduations. The China and Russia are, and Iran as well, are just pumping steam on STEM. STEM goes for what is it?
Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
Engineering and mathematics, exactly.
Well, I think Raphael did mention it in the beginning. It's the stagnation that is sourced from the very system itself. It's neoliberalism running into basically its endpoint and not having anywhere else to expand as far as capitalism goes. So I think that was the answer. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, it's basically like that, and I would even add the fact that if we're specifically talking about universities, these countries have embraced what we could call the reign of quantity, in the sense that they are not meritocratic anymore. China is an extremely meritocratic society nowadays. Iran is an extremely meritocratic society, and while the Western universities, of course, they still produce a lot of things, especially because there's the brain drain that, for example, affected, of course, Russia, and also always affects other countries. So if you keep receiving people from India, Brazil, Russia, and other countries, of course, you're going to keep producing interesting stuff. But it's mostly preoccupied with all these ridiculous stuff we have mentioned before, that we could sum it up into wokeism, So these societies are not preoccupied with quality anymore.
Yeah, the other one is from Julius Caesar. So, is the United States aware about Asian soft power regarding media invasion? This question is tricky because, through YouTube, doramas, Chinese soap operas, and I always talk about doramas. I hate them. And growing popularity of those geopolitical tools in countries like Brazil. And I guess the mistake in this question is that, so doramas are South Korean, Chinese soap operas, I haven't heard about them. I know nothing about them. And YouTube, yeah, that's more or less what we do here, a tiny bit of soft power.
Well, we even have Chinese gaming industry competing with the Western gaming industry.
And
Uh,
pumping steam.
yes, I don't know if they noticed. If they noticed, they haven't seemed to have done anything about it, because if we are talking specifically about the gaming industry, the US keeps pumping ridiculous games. For example, there's some new RPG game, where a medieval fantasy RPG game, I think it's the new Dragon Age, and I only played the first one, I think, where the characters are talking about pronouns. And well, it basically failed in its first weeks trying to sell it. So, and that's important because yes, it's part of soft power, it's part of the cultural wars, etc. But no, the Western world haven't seemed to be doing anything about that. And if they are going to do it, they are probably going to appeal to censorship before changing what they are doing. So if they'll do anything, they will put pressure on Netflix to drop the Turkish soap operas. In Brazil, it's the Turkish soap operas and the South Korean doramas that are popular. So they maybe, for example, pressure Steam into abandoning that new Chinese game, which I forgot the name, which is about the monkey guy, and that's going to be they haven't, because they really feel that they are right in what they are doing, right from the standpoint of the values that they are defending. People from the left wing, especially in Brazil, don't think that all of the wokeism stuff, the postmodern liberal progressive stuff, it's basically opportunistic, it's for money. No, these guys really believe in that. They would die for it. Not everyone, some of these businesses are very opportunistic, but most of them actually believe in that, and they would prefer their businesses to fail before abandoning that, especially because nowadays with stakeholder capitalism, well, one of the 100 business that you have 5 or 10% stake in fail, you have another 99 businesses that you can keep investing on. So they care much less about the future of the companies themselves than in the 19th century capitalism, where we have the direct relationship between the bourgeois owner, which is always there in the place, and the working class, which is also always there. It's something much more virtual and fragmentary and postmodern in this sense. So let it know. To give it a short answer, no, there's no US strategy against South Korean doramas and Turkish soap operas and Chinese video games yet.
I would say that the Chinese and Russians still rely on traditional soft power heavily, for instance, in the realm of sports, right? So Olympic placement is very important to China, as it was to Russia, which is why Russia is banned from a lot of these international competitions, because they consistently perform very well in the number of traditional Russian fields like figure skating, gymnastics, biathlon, etc. So again, it's a matter of censorship, i.e. banning in this particular category, as opposed to adjusting one's own perception and perhaps maybe doing a little bit of self-reflection. But I think we're going to wrap it up at this stage. Thank you so much for coming on. This was really elucidating.
Just one very quick point, and I think another point there is that with all that we discuss here, perhaps Russia and China are not that interested in export their culture. They are interested in business, not export their cultures to other countries. Not that much, at least. But yeah, please, Nina.
No, I think you're right in the sense that they don't want to export it with the intention of dominating, but they are interested in having a positive image. And I think Russian and Chinese media, especially the Russian media that was banned, we all know what that one is, have been doing better than they were doing 10 years ago, but I don't think they've caught up to the Western models yet. but that doesn't mean they will not catch up in the next few years. Thank you so much for coming on, and this is very interesting. We haven't talked about the G7 in the context of BRICS, so we covered a lot of ground. Would love to have you back maybe when we do more Latin American historic subjects if you're interested. And thank you everyone for watching. Marcelo, any parting words?
Yeah, thank you very much, Raphael. Also, by last minute call as well, answering for it. Thank you very much for the presence. Yes, remember everybody that we have a show in the IDM called Pontapé Inicial, which is the kickoff in English, which we Raphael and I ask the questions, kind of analyze more or less of the Ibero-American society and what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, well, I forgot the word. So thank you everybody for watching us. Don't remember that all the links are on the description. You can follow Raphael on Twitter and also YouTube. So follow him and see you guys next week. And yeah, happy Thanksgiving, Nina.
Happy Thanksgiving to our American friends. Thank you, everyone, and see you next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.